Welcome, everybody. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. For those of you who don't know us, we are an institute based in Washington, D.C., and dedicated to the promotion of restraint in US and European foreign policy, to the opposition to the pursuit of US primacy or Western primacy by military means and by intervention, and in favor, when possible, it isn't always, of cooperation in international affairs. Before introducing Richard Sakwa, our guest today, I just wanted to flag another book talk coming up next week, next Thursday at the same time, the 24th. I will be interviewing Matt Burrows of the Stimson Centre and Josef Bramel of the Trilateral Commission about their new book, World to Come, The Return of Trump and the End of the Old Order. So I hope you can also come to that. Now, today, it's a great pleasure to speak with an old friend, Richard Sakwa. Richard is the Professor Emeritus of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent in England. He's one of the foremost experts in the West on Russia, Ukraine, and Russia's relations with the West. He's the author of several leading books on the subject, controversial books too, if I may say so, including Frontline Ukraine and Deception, sorry, I can't read my own writing, Russiagate and the New Cold War. And today we will be discussing Richard's latest book, The Culture of the Second World, the Culture of the Second Cold War. Here it is. So, Richard, welcome. So nice to see you again. Could I ask you, first of all, could you describe for us your analysis of the culture of the Second World War, and also perhaps say in what ways it resembles and how or if it differs from the culture of the First Cold War?
Yeah, indeed. Basically, my argument is that we're living still, if you like, in the post-war years. This year, of course, is the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. 40 years, of course, since the beginning of Gorbachev's perestroika. He came to power just last month, 40 years ago. So 80 years afterwards, in those years, we saw after 1945 the establishment of what I call the political West. Russians like to talk about the collective West. And of course, Westerners talk about the Atlantic system and transatlanticism. It doesn't really matter what you call it, but this power system emerged. And of course, it then assumed after Gorbachev put an end to the Cold War that it achieved some sort of victory. But the problem has been that the ultimate structures of Cold War were never overcome. So Cold War continued in a different way. I earlier called it a cold peace. Of course, then after 2014 and the onset of the intense phase of the European security crisis, of which Ukraine is the sharpest manifestation, we then plunge into the Second Cold War. What makes it different? Two things. First, it is a Cold War. Much debate about it, but the argument is that a Cold War is a very specific form of great power politics, and of course shaped by the nuclear threat and a peculiar intensity in which it isn't just normal great power politics, but you have this normative level or ethical level in which the enemy, the problem is the essence of the enemy, that they're somehow or other they're illegitimate. And of course, then this leads to a black and white Manichaean world of good versus evil, or as our dear departed friend Joe Biden used to put it, democracies versus autocracies, and other simplifications and mystifications. And, there's a peculiar intensity to the Second Cold War. This intensity takes all sorts of things. One, of course, is the absence of diplomacy, the almost no contact in the final 3 years of the Biden administration between Moscow and Washington is just one example. The destruction of diplomatic institutions and staffing levels, the endless expulsions and everything else. There's also a peculiar type of what I call hermeticism, a closed character to the Western politics, this political West, in which it simply assumes that the Western form of life is genuinely universal. Anyone who stands against it is to be is not just mistaken, but fundamentally evil, and therefore regime change operations and other stratagems are perfectly legitimate. Of course, this has huge blowback effects onto our society, to Western society itself, as we see with the erosion of democracy, and democracy then becomes uh, if you like, becomes type of an exercise in democratism, where it becomes superficial rather than genuinely what others would call agonistic. That is, the real genuine debate over fundamental issues of importance to a political community. So there's a peculiar intensity about this Cold War. I mean, there's so many other things we could say, but just one key final point is that in the first Cold War, we understood it was easy to understand socialism versus capitalism, the liberalism versus so-called totalitarianism. This one, it's just not clear what the fundamental divisions really are. They're profound, they're deep, they're pervasive, but what is it? Yes, we can use words democracy versus autocracy, but then of course, why target Russia and not Saudi Arabia or any number of other states? So it's a very strange sort of pervasive and ultimately far more dangerous situation because, as you said, not just a second Cold War, we're in the foothills of the Third World War, and that makes it exceptionally dangerous. So that's some of the ideas in the book, though, of course, I give more detail about what sort of mechanisms are at work.
I mean, one thing that worries me profoundly, following on precisely from what you said, uh, was that in the first Cold War, the West was opposed to a communist ideology. Um, you know, I mean, much of which was indeed profoundly bad. Now, and there were, of course, endless attempts to associate this intrinsically with Russia, but nonetheless, um, in part because, of course, Western governments wanted to appeal to the Russian population itself, the shall we say, ethnic chauvinist or national chauvinist aspects were, distinctly played down. Whereas now, free rein has really been given, it seems to me, to a discourse about Russia, which really echoes, some, well, German above all, language about Russia before the First World War or between the wars, a specifically view of a nation as intrinsically bad, evil, barbarous, and so forth. That seems to me a throwback to a very dark tradition in European history.
Indeed. In the first Cold War, the idea was to cancel communism, if I may put it like that. Now, the idea is to cancel Russia as a society. And hence we have all the cancellations of concerts, of sports engagement, and so much more this time, which would be hardly even considered in the first Cold War. That's why I say it's so much deeper. And why I insist on using the term Cold War, because I mean, obviously, Cold War doesn't cover everything that's going on in world politics today, or even in the relationship between European and United States powers. But nevertheless, it captures this precisely that quality, this intense delegitimation of the other, an existential repudiation of its very existence and right to existence. And of course, this is something that perhaps in the 19th century Polish nationalists would have fed into the European body politic. And of course, the Jewish emigration from the 1890s with experiences of pogroms also added to this, what some call Russophobia. And of course, today Ukrainians really do mobilize and argue that Russia's very existence is a threat, and hence this language of decolonization, which means basically destroying, dismantling the Russian state, which is, well, exceptionally dangerous for many, many reasons, quite apart from the fact it's a nuclear power, the largest in the world.
Now, of course, your book was written before the last US elections, and the the Trump administration's, by the look of things, radically new policies or attempts at them, which certainly do transform things at the moment from, a US perspective. How far do you think they really transform them? And is this likely to prove, in your view, long lasting? Or is the hostility to Russia now basically baked in to the West as a whole? Oh, for that matter, I mean, I suppose, does the West itself exist anymore?
Mm. Indeed. As I suggested earlier, we're at the end of a 40-year cycle from the end of the first Cold War and an 80-year cycle of the post-war years. What Trump has done, vis-a-vis certainly the first one, he's been asking questions that should have been asked and answered at the end of the first Cold War. What's the point of NATO? What sort of new pan-continental neo-Gaullist system can we establish in Europe, all the way from Lisbon to Vladivostok, if you remember all that talk which used to be very dominant in those times. And Trump, of course, I mean, he's got no time for that. Yet he's acting like an icebreaker. He himself may not deliver the answers, but what he's doing is forging a path, perhaps through which others will follow, because he's dismantling so much. And I do think, who knows? I mean, his term is effectively, he's not allowed, well, we shall see, a third term. Yet, nevertheless, I mean, he has a potential successor in J.D. Vance and perhaps others. So the Trumpian challenge will continue, in my view. But as you say, this political West, just at the time when I'm beginning to get a handle on it, and we all are, the so-called rules-based order and all of that, just when we begin to get a handle on it, as usual, it disappears in front of our eyes. What's going on, in my view, is a double defection. A bit like Russia defecting from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 90s, something which we never really anticipated. We assumed it would be the Baltic Republic, South Caucasus, and so on. But it's the center defects from its own system. So today we have a double defection by Trump. First, from at the level of international politics, from the alliance system in particular with the European powers. That's the first defection, effectively, saying, this is a burden and the usual language. But the second defection is more disturbing, and that is from the normative framework established in 1945, what I call the Charter International System, based on the United Nations. And as we know, under Trump, United States is planning to leave UNESCO and all stacks of other United Nations agencies and many, many other multilateral bodies. So this is a double defection, which was signaled and really wasn't substantially reversed in the Biden years. So we're entering, in my view, a new, after this, the first 40 years from 45 to 85, 85 to 2025. I think we really are entering a new time in which I think there's huge potential for new patterns of politics. Unfortunately, I mean, these are much debated in the United States, and of course, your own Quincy Institute's done a lot of work in outlining the possibilities for a genuine post-Cold War type of international politics, overcoming ambitions for dominance, primacy, hegemony, and so many other things.
Yes, I mean, it's fascinating, as you say, in the case of Russia defecting from the Soviet, well, at least from the Soviet bloc, America, you could say, Britain and France in the 1950s, or Portugal a bit later as well. Populations in, if you like, the imperial metropolis, basically no longer being willing to bear the costs of empire. The financial, the military burdens of sustaining these empires, which the masses didn't really think were benefiting them. But of course, on the other hand, as we've seen, the Russians did not think when they, decided to give up not just Eastern Europe, but um, Central Asia as well. They didn't think that this was going to destroy their influence, in countries that they saw as vital to them. And so, of course, we see Trump perhaps pulling back from Europe, opposing American wars of intervention, hopefully, but trying to consolidate American power in North America, even to the point of threatening to try to annex another country and a section of another country. I wonder if there's an interesting, but also, of course, somewhat disquieting parallel there as well.
Very much so. The empire has changed its spots, but it's still, as it were, continuing with certain ambitions of dominating international politics, certainly a retrenchment. So it's a very ambivalent process going on. As you say, Russia in the Gorbachev, the Soviet Union first, and then Russia after 1985, assumed that as they left a burden of empire, that they moved into a new phase. This was never considered a capitulation to the political West, to the Cold War antagonist. It was assumed to be something in conformity and going back to that vision of comity, a word I quite like nowadays, of 1945, of cooperation between the great powers. And that it really was a driving idea of Gorbachev's new political thinking, or which, of course, had been developed in the last 20 odd years of the Soviet Union. Today, I'm not sure there are any such ideas, and that's the terrible thing. Comity's out, and so we may be entering a new age of global anarchy. It's not because the United States is no longer hegemonic; it's because in removing itself from its old patterns and dominance of the political West and of its own system. It's actually undermining the system itself. So this is the paradox of this double withdrawal, something that the Soviet Union, Russia never did. They left their own empire, but they were trying to reinforce that charter international system. Today, the whole temple is being pulled down as the US. So we've all moves towards that position of restraint. But I mean, just how restrained it is, I'm not sure. It's of course, some of this moving back from Europe is designed to reestablish dominance in East Asia, and above all, vis-a-vis China.
I mean, you mentioned Gorbachev, and I mean, I also regard myself very much as, somebody of the Gorbachev era, if you like,
Mm.
who shared some of his vision and dreams. I mean, now everybody seems to have abandoned this, and Gorbachev is hard. I mean, when one remembers Gorby mania, and also, of course, his absolutely critical role in the reunification of Germany, in the peaceful transformation of Eastern Europe, and now nobody talks about him at all. I wonder how long it will be before uh, a real nostalgia for Gorbachev and appreciation of his achievements comes back.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, as a political leader, he had grave flaws. The inability to build that genuine and sustainable alliance within the country. The idea that Ligachev, remember the old conservative, he supported the changes, and so many others, and yet ultimately they ended up alienating them. But in terms of the big argument, as I say, he wanted to go back to this vision of 1945, that there was no need for this Cold War. So he genuinely tried to transcend that logic of Cold War, and that is his tragedy. Well, he did that, but at the same time, his failure to achieve a sustainable I mean, governance system for the Soviet Union, then ultimately inherited by Russia, which then was resolved by the 1993 bombing of Parliament, because he handed a totally confused system of governance. So indeed, you're quite right that Gorbachev is, a, a giant, yet with enormous flaws as a
Mm.
political leader. And I think it's not a question of rehabilitating him, but on the other hand, it's establishing a sensible, balanced analysis.
Though I have to say, I mean, having lived in the Soviet Union as a British journalist during those years, I'm awfully glad that it wasn't me who was tasked with, you know, trying to preside over the transformation of that system.
Yeah,
Um, no,
indeed.
not easy. By the way, just a word to the audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and I will pass them on to Richard, or as many of them as we have time for. Um, I want to ask about one tremendous paradox since Trump has come in, which is that for many years after the Cold War, um, it was generally seen to be Washington that was pushing policies which certainly, as seen from Moscow, were hostile to Russia and Russia's interests. And certain leading European countries, well, Germany and France, of course, were uh, really either just unwillingly tagging along behind or actively, trying to slow this down and maintain good relations with Russia. Well, now this has totally flipped. The Trump administration is, trying apparently, to restore not just peace with Ukraine, but a wider détente with Russia. And it's the almost unanimous European establishments which seem determined, to continue the war until Ukrainian victory, not that they can define that. Um, how,
Yeah.
how would you explain this, still to me, somewhat strange transformation?
It's a paradox. You could argue that Washington was only too successful in Americanizing its West European allies, and as Washington's policy changes, as so often in the colonial countries, they become more papist than the Pope. And in this case, I think there's an element of that. There's other factors at work. You could say that their legitimacy now is so deeply embedded in these anti-Russian positions. But that in itself is a result of the way that the European Union developed, not as a functionalist body, but as a territorial quasi-state, a geopolitical entity, even though that essence was denied for so long. And that without the American overlay, then it has been too successful in suppressing that pan-continental vision, which so many of us, and I know you, and certainly me too, and Gorbachev formulated as a common European home. It doesn't. We don't have to use that word. I mean, Mitterrand, of course, and de Gaulle all had this vision of
Mm.
some sort of larger Europe itself acting as a third power in Gaullist terms, uh, and that was all too successfully repressed by Washington. And it's now left with a problem that, as its policy has adjusted and adapted to a new world, that Europe remains stuck in the politics of an earlier age. And the elites of today are very much stuck in this earlier vision of of Atlanticism, and leaving them high and dry. I mean, Emmanuel Todd, for example, has described that very well as the Porażenie Zapada, the La Défaite de l'Ouest, which I think is a very powerful analysis. He argues, of course, that it's because of the exhaustion of Christian of foundations of Europe, and going from a zombie stage to the void itself. And I think there is a void. The absence of debate, the absence of dialogue, the absence of discussion within Europe and between Europe and other interlocutors. But this ultimately puts into question that as the motivating force of the political West in the past, which was the United States, moves away to other concerns, then Europe is left holding and believes itself responsible for that project, and its very legitimacy, and the elites are so vested in it. There's another factor, of course, and that is the whole pattern since the end of the Cold War, and that is the Eastern Europeanization, which has accelerated in recent years of the European Union as a whole. And of course, this is why we have the External Affairs Commissar, Kaja Kallas, and so many East Europeans dominating European politics today. And, I've always argued right from the beginning in the early 1990s that those criteria for joining the European Union, the Copenhagen criteria, needed a fourth one. And that is genuine vision of peace and reconciliation. And unfortunately, the exact opposite happened. And the European Union has been used as an instrument for perpetuating and the how can I put the resentments, which were genuine, of course, of an earlier age, and thus we've imported a precise logic which has transformed the European Union from what I used to believe as a peace and development and reconciliation body, a welfare body, to a warfare body, as a pseudo geopolitical entity. But because of its very absence of a genuine geopolitical core, which of course you could argue was the case for the Soviet Union, then that then all these processes become exaggerated, and of course the sterility of that whole social functioning just means that they cannot allow a genuine debate or genuine democracy, because that would just like the old CPSU and Article 6 had to be dominated, and now a particular elite is doing a similar sort of thing. So neo-Soviet behaviors are then reproduced by a system which allegedly is precisely designed to counter those.
Yes, I must say, I've always been profoundly irritated by this line, in Western Europe, that we have to defer to the Poles and the Balts because they really understand Russia. I've often said that is, a bit like saying that the greatest experts on US policy are the Cheyenne, the Comanche, and the Mexicans.
So,
Well,
yeah,
they have one understands their position, and one understands their past sufferings, but it is unwise to base or would be if anyone did, to base your analysis of America purely on those sources. They're not what you might call unbiased.
indeed, that's exactly that. And the fact that there's been so little pushback, from the Western European leaders, who in fact have bought into this as well, the vision that these Eastern Europeans have unique insight to which everybody else has to bow. Yeah, indeed, it's been very dangerous, and as we see, the European Union then project becomes hijacked to overcome the resentments with genuine and humiliations of the past.
I mean, you mentioned the lack of debate in Europe, and so, not just in the political establishment, but the media, the think tanks. Yesterday, two Europeans of my acquaintance were complaining, bitterly about this, contrasting it actually with America, where
Mm.
there is now, not only because of Trump, but a broader, discussion of the war in Ukraine and of international policy. And of course, as they both made the point, it's not just a question of not engaging in debate, but there have also been some some attempts really to suppress open debate on these issues. And I understand that you yourself have had some experience of these efforts. Perhaps you could tell us something about this.
Yes, a few years ago, the British government launched this thing called the Integrity Initiative, and some of its key figures. Then a recent article has outlined through leaked emails about the way then at a certain point, about 4 years ago, I was then targeted as a dangerous force because but the particular danger which they outlined was, and it was a rather flattering portrait as a dangerous person because he knows too much and has a real understanding of Russia, and that becomes then in this vision a danger and something to be repudiated, which is exactly this de-intellectualization. It's a very frightening process, and the whole notion of lists of people who, I mean, as the Integrity Initiative did, it devised two lists. One, a list of those people who can be considered favorable, and of course, those on the other side who are questionable. It's a very, it's we're not to the level of McCarthyism of the 1950s yet, but it's a sign of this precisely what this is a Cold War behavior. It's what you expect, and it's very disturbing. I mean, as I say in the preface to my book, the culture of the Second Cold War. This began for me very personally, and what prompted the book in the first place was giving a talk in Nottingham to about 100 undergraduate, postgraduate staff members, and amazingly enough, after the talk, and it was an excellent discussion about the Ukraine war and larger issues, and then two staff members had the gall to write to their vice chancellor to call for an inquiry about why I was invited. Absolutely astonishing. Fortunately, the feedback was very good, and a few emails were written on the subject of the talk. But I mean, this was unthinkable even in the UK, even at the height of the Cold War, that your colleagues are denouncing you. There was absolute Soviet-style behavior, and the list of these sort of incidents could be perpetuated. I was teaching at the College of Europe in Natolin a few years ago, and I was absolutely astonished, on European politics, which I've done for many years and always had lively discussions. And in this case, a solid phalanx of Ukrainian and Polish students sat at the back, absolutely stolidly refusing to engage. At coffee break once, I asked one of the students, a German person, what's going on here? And she said, yeah, we've been thoroughly brainwashed. It's exactly that, what I said, this democratism rather than democracy, this sort of superficial of vision of dialogue, as long as you say the right things. It's an absolutely frightening vision, and something which, this book, I wrote precisely to counter that and to explain it and expose it, which perhaps justifies the concern of those behind the Integrity Initiative. Perhaps they were right. I don't know. But fortunately, well, touch wood. And of course, just to say one final thing, we had a debate in Canterbury where I live on, Stop the War Coalition, and at the time I was still employed and calling Vice Chancellor to sack me, and this was open debate. I mean, it's just extraordinary behaviour, and it shows the intellectual and moral exhaustion, certainly in the UK and more broadly in Western Europe. And as you say, in the United States, there's far more lively debate and discussion of these issues.
There is one thing which I think is different from the First Cold War, and which is summed up in this German pejorative phrase or insult, Putin Versteher or Russlands Versteher, which means Putin understander or Russia, understander. Now, I mean, my father was a former British intelligence officer who then perhaps somewhat dubiously, but anyway, joined the BBC External Services as director of their Russia program and then of their East European programs. And, my father was a liberal, but a dedicated anti-communist. But if you had suggested to him, or I think his bosses or his colleagues, that trying to understand the Soviet Union was intrinsically wrong, he wouldn't have he simply would not have been able to understand how anyone could possibly say that in public or maintain it. I mean, he was encouraged to go to. I mean, the Soviet Union after the invasion of Czechoslovakia stopped him going to Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. He was always trying to go and encouraged to go, by the BBC. So that seems to me new. Not
Absolutely.
quite like the first Cold War.
Absolutely. In the First Cold War, the goal was to understand your enemy. In the United Kingdom, you'll remember in the early 1960s, they established a whole set of Hayter centers by this person called Hayter, including a Center for Russian and East European Studies in Birmingham, and designed precisely to understand what was going on in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. Today, the slogan seems to be ignore your enemy or cancel your enemy. And the last thing you want to do is to understand the enemy, because that is even it's even worse than that, because even engaging with the with Russia, for example, is considered appeasement. It's considered already a concession, and dialogue is considered a gift to be given, uh, which obviously you cannot have diplomacy if that's the way you're going. And anybody who does try to understand is this endless comparison with 1938 of Munich and appeasement and so on. These are just so sterile categories, and yet wielded with such gay abandon today, and to close down debate. It's absolutely frightening, and this is why it's so important to have, discussions like this and other ones.
And you said your next book is going to be called The March of Folly, which is of course also the title of Barbara Tuchman's
Yeah.
famous book about the origins of the First World War. And it has often seemed to me that the way in which the European powers stumbled into the First World War is a much better analogy for our present situation than the lead up to the Second World War.
Yes, indeed. And I certainly argue that compared to our generation of leaders, those who sleepwalked into the First World War, could almost be considered, geniuses compared to the very, very low stature. For example, in the United Kingdom, as you say, or the almost complete absence of debate, it's not an accident. It has been suppressed. For example, we now have, a Labour Party in power, and yet where are those independent MPs? Where are the maverick voices? There's a handful of them, and they've been marginalised entirely. And the Labour Party itself has been transformed from a movement in which the peaceniks, as we used to call them, was a very lively and dynamic part of the Labour movement. And the Labour Party has now been turned into a vote gathering machine. And it's very effective. And as we saw in the July 2024 election, given a huge 400 plus majority, no, not majority, but 400 plus seats. And yeah, but yet, where's that debate? Where's that liveliness? It's gone. And it wasn't an accident. It's been very consciously suppressed. Uh, and and there's nothing more dangerous when you don't have voices from outside. You end up in an echo chamber. You end up making huge mistakes. And of course, the stakes at the present time in Europe are so enormous. And of course, trying to impede the peace talks or whatever process which Trump and Witkoff and the US administration is trying to do today. So, as you say, Europe now on our own continent. And, all right from the very beginning, I've always argued it's astonishing that European Union should have been the first to run to Istanbul or Kiev and Moscow to try to dampen the fires of war on our own continent. By the way, the Tuchman March of Folly, it's precisely that, from the Peloponnesian War to Vietnam, where leaders damaged their own cause by engaging in these foolish wars. And so it was going to be called the March of Folly Resumed, and that we're continuing. I'm not sure the publishers like that, but we shall see how it ends up. But it is a deep study of how the Russo-Ukrainian war, the causes, and indeed the consequences.
We have several questions from the audience, inevitably, about how you think the war could end, or be resolved peacefully. Reach peace. Could you tell us any of your views on
Mm.
this? What do you think a viable peace settlement could be?
Mm. There's yeah, I was dreading that question because it's
Well, I know, I know.
indeed.
Yeah, me
Yeah,
too.
but it's an important one, and we have to engage with it. I've always argued that ultimately there's four big moving parts involved here, and it's like a Rubik's cube, and you have to get them all lined up, and it's not going to be possible. But at least if you identify the issues, then hopefully then you can begin to work. And the first one really is the intra-Ukrainian conflict, which has been, bubbling away for, well, generations, you'd say, but certainly very sharply in recent decades. And we know that there is another Ukraine. This is I've defined it as terms of a conflict between monism and pluralism, a rather limited and sometimes generous, ethno-nationalist vision of Ukraine vis-a-vis the, multi-confessional, multilingual, multicultural vision. The second level is the specific Kiev-Moscow axis, which really has to be re-established. The third one is the European level of security, and of course, the fourth one is the US or great power Washington-Moscow relationship. And so where we are today is, of course, at the top level, Washington-Moscow is engaging in debate, and certainly I very much welcome it. And unfortunately, there's total blockage on the other three levels, and that's going to really make it very, very difficult to engage. And of course, Moscow's arguing that the root causes have to be dealt with, and that's just common sense. Of course, anything else is a ceasefire. We do know, the partition today of Cyprus since 1974, Korea, of course, other examples, and it's much worse in this case that a ceasefire which doesn't open the door to a more sustainable peace order is pointless. In fact, makes it worse because if it gives an example, gives an opening for France and Britain to send their so-called peacekeeping forces into Ukraine, then of course potentially transforms a regional war into a full-scale continental, if not larger, global war. So, I mean, in other words, it's more dangerous sometimes as you come to the
Yes.
end game than earlier. And the dangers are huge at this time.
Yeah. No, I entirely agree. I strongly advocate as comprehensive a peace
Yeah.
settlement and as formal as can be achieved.
And just to open the issues, have debate the issues, and the interlocutors should start to talk to each other. Hence Zelensky's vision, and of course he hasn't removed that law which bans even talk, which is just absurd. I mean, they should have
Mm.
mercy and try to save their own country.
There is this perception in Europe, although I've never been very much value your views on this. Uh, I can't really fully understand how people can actually believe this. That, unless Russia is, defeated in Ukraine, it will go on to attack NATO and the European Union directly. I mean, all the evidence of Russia's military limitations in Ukraine. Oh, one second, I need to plug it in again. Sorry, my IT manager is giving me a hand. Um, uh, suggest that this is not in fact possible, and of course, the Russian government has described this again and again as ridiculous. Do you think that people are sincere in expressing this fear? Or is this more, you remember the famous advice of Senator Vandenberg to Acheson when Acheson was, trying to get his help in, I think, passing the establishment of NATO through the US Senate. And Vandenberg's advice was scare the hell out of them. So, I mean, the only way you can get European publics to pay for greatly increased military budgets, for example, is to convince them that the Russian bear is coming to eat their children. Or I mean, you're there, I'm not. Do people
Mm.
genuinely believe that the Russian bear is going to come and attack Europe?
Yeah. The most dangerous moment in a war, I suppose, is when generals start to believe their own propaganda. And I have a feeling that our political generation of leaders has been so consumed, but and at such low level intellectually, that they're actually beginning to believe their own propaganda, or it's not even their own. The propaganda put forwards by the what we used to call the yellow press, the jingoist press of the 1890s, the Daily Mail, of course, then and now, in the van of all of that. And the second thing is, of course, the dominance of the idea of domino theory, the one that precisely led to the disaster of the Vietnam War. That, if they don't stop them in Vietnam, then it's going to go on to Laos and Cambodia, etc. And of course, that proved to be quite wrong because the North Vietnamese were concerned about Vietnam and no more. Uh, well, indeed, so you're absolutely right. It's so bizarre, this idea that it's not just a military capacity. Russia's got no ideological, no motivation. And therefore, that takes us back to the causes of this war, which I've always argued. It is all about security. I mean, there's other cultural and other elements, obviously, overlay all those issues. And as in any conflict, there's multiple factors at work. But nevertheless, the fundamental one was security. And if you can deal with that, and of course, the sense of responsibility for what they assume to be a Russophone community within Ukraine itself, and other larger communities. But it's certainly not, Russia is not an expansive state in this vision that is an imperial aggrandizement. It's got enough territory by far and too small a population, even for the existing territories. But
There's
yes,
also,
it's
yeah,
just not being counted. This is just, you're absolutely right. This question disturbs me so much. Can they really believe their own war talk?
and of course there is a deep contradiction because the argument has been, and that has a certain validity, that for Russians and for Putin, Ukraine is a very, very special issue in historical and ethnic and cultural terms. I mean, the line about, you know, simply seeing Ukrainians as not existing has been exaggerated. But certainly, I mean, the belief that Russians and Ukrainians are closely related peoples who ought to be together is very, very deeply present in Russia. But nobody thinks that about Russians and Poles. I mean, nobody in Russia thinks of Poles in that way. Um, so there's a deep contradiction in this rhetoric, which is simply not addressed.
And that the frightening thing is that way back, well before Putin, I'm thinking of Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, and his other associated arguments in the mid-1990s. We must absolutely stop Russia and Ukraine getting together in one form or another. That would make Russia a great power and empire, etc. And of course, they were only too successful in poisoning relations. Obviously, there's plenty within Ukraine. We're more than happy to go along with that, which, of course, meant that the monist line undermined and destroyed ultimately that genuinely pluralistic vision of Ukraine, which needed, as I've said, argued for 30 years, needed to be given a constitutional representation of when people say, dismissively, there's no problem with the Russian language, you can go and talk Russian in your kitchen. How insulting is that?
Mm.
And it's what makes me so even sad is that Ukraine had such enormous, as you've written about yourself, so much potential, such a talented people, such a marvelous people in my view, and yet their inability to give genuine political expression and indeed economic expression because it was an oligarch democracy, we all know that, and its various distortions. And so they squandered their own future, and I very much fear that they may well squander Europe's future as a whole and Russia's as well.
An interesting question from the audience about Cold Wars. Were there any earlier Cold Wars in history? Relationships that could be called Cold Wars, before the late 1940s, early 1950s? Because it's often struck me that in the past, you had a war and then you had a peace, and they were
Mm.
very clearly divided. And I mean, during peace, all the British aristocrats went off to Paris again, as they did, and French scientists came to London, and everybody started traveling and interacting perfectly freely again and marrying each other. And then, of course, there was another war, and they all to a degree had to separate, but then that war stopped, and they. Whereas, can you think of a previous example of where, at a time of supposed peace, you have at the same time a totally exclusive and militarized attitude to the other countries?
I mean, I think one of the definitions of a Cold War is that it's a very specific phenomenon of the nuclear age, because you'd have a peace after a jolly terrible war, but that war would have a beginning, a middle, and an end, usually in that order. Whereas in the Cold War, in the nuclear age, they sort of drag on, and of course, uh, and there's a peculiar quality, of course, to the relationship of Russia and the West. And as we've sort of intimated before, Russia is a very specific subject in all of this. The worst thing about the end of the first Cold War is that it didn't end up with a peace conference. There was no Vienna, and instead of which, the first Cold War ended, if you like, as a normative settlement that certain principles were going to be dominated, human rights and other elements, democracy, fine things, of course, but therefore it ended up as a normative end to that conflict and not a diplomatic end to it, which, of course, was very different, say, to Vienna, where France, as a defeated power, was then invited and became part of the system immediately. Of course, the failure of Versailles was to do the exact opposite with Germany, and that's why so many Russian commentators say that after 1989-91, Russia was then humiliated by a Versailles type peace, which of course, as Marshal Foch said, this is no peace. It's just a a temporary reprieve from war before we continue. And of course, they did in 1939. And so the Cold War that ended in 1989 was then resumed in 2014.
Yeah, yeah. A couple of questions about the Putin regime in Russia. Um, there are, of course, as we all know, many reasons to dislike it and be critical of it, especially of course, in aspects of its domestic policy and its approach to Russian opposition or Russian critics. In your view, are there any reasons to admire aspects of the present Russian setup by comparison with the West?
The Putin system, as I've argued for many years, is a very complex system. It's not just at the moment, and the West has a vision that Putin is all powerful, all seeing, omniscient, and so on. Any ruler of Russia would be very quickly disabused of this. The leader sits in the Kremlin, pulls all sorts of levers, and nothing happens in Krasnoyarsk, let alone in Vladivostok. Russia has 146 autochthonous peoples. That is, peoples who are native only to Russia, quite apart from, 50 more others, Poles and Ukrainians, who have a homeland elsewhere. That's just one dimension. I've also argued about the, very powerful, let's not call them interest groups, but, factions within Russia. There's the liberals who are now, of course, in political liberals very much marginalized, as you suggest. But the economic liberals are still in power. Elvira Nabiullina, at the head of the central bank, is a classic economic liberal. And despite the shift towards a type of Keynesian militarism, military economy in the last few years, it's still a market economy. It's still a competitive economy. Obviously, a statist inflection, a very powerful one, an increasingly powerful one, and many other factions. There's the neo-Soviet or neo-traditionalist ones, the Communist Party, marginalized politically, yet nevertheless its ideas are still very much out there. And one could continue in this vein to say that, there's hierarchy, sure, the so-called vertical of power, but there's also what I've argued a heterarchy, which means horizontalism, and Russia's constantly battling to combat centrifugal forces. So positive, of course, is just anybody who's been to any Russian city over the last 10, 15 years will note the fantastic transformation. Russia is also, of course, far more digitally advanced than backward England. I mean, it's shocking just how backward the United Kingdom is in terms of e-governance compared to Russia, where you have these one-stop social support networks, these service centers where, I visited a couple of years back. Absolutely extraordinary. 82 computers, little cubicles, fully staffed, where people who don't have computers can come and work and be given support. That's welfare payments, pensions, one-stop shop for every social need. And that is admirable, devised by Mikhail Mishustin, the Prime Minister. So this idea, this demonization of Russia and demonization of Putin covers and hides far, far more than it reveals. And so this is where one has to understand Russia and Putin himself as a very complex leader. As you say, we can criticize it, and we do, with all sorts of. I'd love to see far more pluralism and debate and open debate, but on the other hand, it's far, far from that Stalinist vision that some of its opponents suggest.
And I mean, I doubt that they would have sustained this war in the way that they had if, in fact, they had not managed to generate a reasonable degree of social solidarity on the basis of their economic policies and achievements over the past generation.
Absolutely.
Now, another question, how, because what one also sees now within America and within Europe and between Europe and America is the fact that voices for peace in Ukraine or détente with Russia from sort of liberal or progressive side have found it even more difficult to express themselves because, of course, now this is associated with Trump. So many of domestic policies in particular, they find, I could say we find, absolutely detestable. Is this now an increasing problem for voices for peace on the left that Trump in a way has I don't know, somehow tarnished or discredited them by association?
Unfortunately, that discrediting took place well before Trump. It's obviously worse now. The Democratic Party in the United States has become the war party. The Labour Party in the United Kingdom has joined the Conservatives as a war party. But as you say, the voice of the left now is highly well, it was been compromised for a good few years. And where's the? I mean, we have in the United Kingdom the Stop the War Coalition, which I think is an admirable organisation in all sorts of ways, but it's one of the few voices. It's the campaign for nuclear disarmament still is making its peace noises, but it's nothing. It's a shadow of what it once was. Uh, yeah, you're absolutely right. That, and of course, the fact that détente with Russia has now become a MAGA project makes it more suspicious. Yeah, and of course, there's intensified voices about this axis of evil of, of the axis of resistance, Iran, North Korea, and Russia, who of course are in wartime conditions, understandably drawn closer to each other. So you're right that that Trumpism has stolen the thunder, which we would have liked to have seen coming from the left for over the last few years.
Yeah. But of course, now in Europe, you also see increasingly, and not just in Eastern Europe, but sections in Western Europe as well, um, on the right mainly, but expressing, of course, some of the doubts or hostility to the European Union that used to be on the left. Um, I mean, is there and people from Eastern Europe sometimes say that we didn't escape this, the Soviet bloc and Soviet domination only to be ruled by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. Do you think, I mean, how powerful a sentiment is this? Well, of course, you had Brexit in England. I mean, is the European Union actually going to be able to sustain itself in its present form and sustain its policies for very long?
I think there's a huge question mark about it. If they go down to defeat in Ukraine, and that's perhaps one reason why they're doubling down on the war, is that if they do suffer defeat, if the political West, that is NATO and European Union, and of course the European Union itself has become intensely NATOized over the last few years, which is very frightening. It repudiates its very initial ideas as a peace project. Uh, yeah, the intellectual wind is blowing from the right today. And we see that with the Trump phenomenon in the United States, where the blue collar workers supported him overwhelmingly, and so many others. And in the United Kingdom, there's almost, I mean, the left has been gutted by Labour Party's betrayal, in my view, betrayal of its principles. Uh, and it's even its procedures, in the fact that it has
Yeah.
administratively stifled alternative voices, which I think is perhaps the most frightening thing of all, which opens the door to a whole ecosystem, echoes as well,
Mm.
ecosystem on the right. GB News is a right wing, Unheard, this rather marvelous forum for debate and very interesting ideas. That's a right-wing project, and the Spectator, perhaps even under Paul Marshall, who's also funded Unheard, is providing a platform. Where's the equivalent on the left? It's just not there. But the fundamental point is that the sovereigntists are on the march in Europe. And I think this is a healthy phenomenon because ultimately the European Union in this war has exposed itself. The fact that it has now militarized, and the way that Ursula von der Leyen Commission has centralized power, has stifled its own voices, and of course, tried to marginalize Viktor Orban in Hungary and Robert Fico in Slovakia, when they're saying, look, we're having these meetings and you're never discussing peace. We're not saying it won't come tomorrow, it won't come the day after, but you need to start a process. That's any peace things. It may take years, but at least you've got to, the longest journey starts with the first step. And they're not taking that first step. And that's what they're criticizing today. And that really is shocking. And of course, Kubilius and all the others in the European Commission are thoroughly East Europeanized, and have thoroughly lost that pan-continental vision. Hence, you could say neo-Gaullism is on the march. And I've been going to France this last the last few months, and it's visible everywhere. There's new student generation. They are, they're not right wing, not left wing. They're just simply saying, we've got to. We don't buy into the rhetoric coming from the European Commission and our own leaders. And that's why Macron is really such a busted flush today.
Yeah. Well, Richard, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion. I'm afraid we're out of time. I apologize to the members of the audience whose questions I couldn't get to, and I urge you all very strongly to get this book, The Culture of the Second Cold War. Richard, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.